Disclaimer. La, Shub Niggurath. La, J.K. Rowling. Author's note. The Colors of Infinity is available on YouTube, and despite being rather dated by now, I do recommend it. Put yourself in the shoes of someone who has only seen early 1990s computer graphics and imagine how amazing it was. I saw it as a child around the same time Hermione did, and it inspired a lifelong interest in fractals. "Wow, you managed a perfect apparition in your second lesson?" George said. "Nobody ever pulls that off." "Well, Percy did it in his first lesson, but he's not human," Fred added. "Had a couple of splinchings in the first lesson in our year," George continued, "but no one got it right till week 4. "I think a lot of it was luck, honestly," Hermione told them. "I'm a long way from being able to do it at speed, and I still managed to splinch myself once." She shivered at the thought. She'd nearly fainted when she shifted her weight to one foot and left the other one behind. It hadn't hurt as much as she'd expected. It stung badly, but carving those words into her hand had been worse. And it had been easy to fix. The stump was distorted, as if it had been pinched off by the wormhole, so it wasn't gushing blood. The fix had been to simply bring the foot near the stump and cast a spell to undistort the space, and they connected back together flawlessly with a strange puff of purple smoke. It was only splinching on the head and torso, which was much rarer, that was really dangerous. "Happens to everyone," George assured her. "I'm sure you'll ace the test. So what do you think of the shop?" Hermione had come to 93 Diagon Alley early on the day of the grand opening of Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, where the three of them stood behind a ribbon with a giant pair of scissors. Her idea. She took another look at the shop. It was probably the most colorful store she had ever seen. The rest of the shops in the alley were dull and covered with wanted posters and ministry safety guides. But WWW seemed to have enough color for all of them. Over the door, an enormous ventriloquist dummy-style figure of a Weasley twin kept tipping his hat, making a rabbit appear and disappear under it. That was a prank in itself, since only Muggleborns would understand it. They'd been lucky enough to get a corner lot, and they were taking advantage of it. The left-hand window was filled with all manner of flashing and noise-making products, while the right-hand window was covered with an enormous poster mocking the ministry ones, advertising something called You-Know-Poo. "I think selling an anti-diarrheal potion as a prank product is ridiculous," she deadpanned. Not to mention that they'd bumped themselves up a few spots on Voldemort's hit list. "Party pooper," said Fred. "Don't even go there, Fred. The shop looks brilliant. No one's going to miss it, that's for sure. I think you can see it from space." A crowd had gathered in front of them. Many of the older witches and wizards were gawking at the shop, while those who knew the Weasley twins were grinning, and the younger children gazed in wide-eyed wonder. A clock somewhere chimed 9 o'clock, and the boys sprang into action. "Welcome, welcome, one and all, to Weasley's Wizard Wheezes," George and Fred said in unison. "The newest and best place to go for pranks, jokes, gags, and general mayhem for witches and wizards of all ages," Fred continued. "Exclusive home of the skiving snack box, the extendable ear, and Weasley's Wildfire Whiz-Bangs," George said. "Licensed sellers of wandless potion kits and self-spellcasting runes," Hermione added. Since they were her inventions, the runes with help from Ron, it was only natural that they added them to the product line. "And debuting new this season," George said, "the Pygmy Puff." He made a show of using sleight of hand to make a pink pygmy puff appear from under a handkerchief, making all the young girls in the audience say, "Aww." "And for the Wizard of Action, the Shield Cloak." Fred swung a gray cloak with a shield design on it over his magenta robes. "Hermione?" Hermione pointed her wand at him. "Stupefy!" The spell splashed off the cloak with a red flash, and the crowd applauded. "Guaranteed to block 10 stunners or your money back." "Restrictions apply. Results may vary," Hermione quipped. George laughed and ruffled her hair. "And now," Fred announced, "witches and wizards, children of all ages, we declare Weasley's Wizard Wheezes." The three of them cut the ribbon with the giant scissors. "Open!" The crowd cheered and surged forward, pushing the trio into the shop. For the next several hours, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes was barely controlled chaos, as witches and wizards from the ages of 5 to 25, if not older, bought all manner of prank items. They sold what Hermione considered to be a worrying amount of mild love potions, mostly to the target demographic of teenage girls, which surprised her. Quite a few of the parents were interested in the shield cloaks, as was a ministry official who bemoaned the incompetence of his co-workers at casting shield charms. Several young Muggle-born students came up to her and asked if their parents could use the wandless potion kits. She was pleased to see other Muggle parents showing such an interest in their children's lives. And, of course, fireworks were set off either accidentally or deliberately, approximately once every 17 minutes. Late in the morning, the rest of the Weasleys' clan arrived. Mr. and Mrs. Weasley, Bill, Ron, and Ginny, plus Harry. Hagrid was escorting them, making the group look twice as large as it was. All of them had promised to visit on opening day while they did their school shopping. "What were you thinking?" Mrs. Weasley chided when she reached them. "You know, Pooh, you'll be murdered in your beds." "Nah," Fred replied with a grin. "We got Bill to help with the wards. We'll be fine." Ron and Ginny laughed as their mother turned around to berate Bill. "So, kids, what do you think of the shop?" George asked them. "Not sure," Harry replied. "I saw the colors, and I thought I might have had a seizure." The twins laughed and started showing them around. The rest of the Weasley family wasn't as surprised as they might have been about all the new products they'd developed since they'd spent a month at Grimmauld Place planning and developing before they leased the building. But they were still surprised at the sheer volume of wares they were peddling. Ron was grabbing a suspicious quantity of decoy detonators, and Harry was seriously considering buying a shield cloak. Ginny had already adopted a pygmy puff, but she was still interested in the patented daydream charms. "Fred and George never let me try the finished product," she told Hermione. "Said I wasn't old enough." "Well, they can be a little..." Hermione searched for the word. "Intense? Teenage daydreams aren't always, appropriate viewing material." Ginny didn't exactly know the phrase, but she got the gist. "Speaking from experience, are you?" she asked, wagging her eyebrows. Hermione blushed. "I helped test them. They sent me a couple finished ones this summer. Ask them if they'll let you buy a Quidditch World Cup fantasy. That one's fun, and it should be pretty clean." Ginny stared. "I thought you didn't like Quidditch." "No, I don't like flying on a broom with minimal safety features, but a daydream is fine. Actually, it was the most fun I've ever had flying." She handed Ginny one of the charms. "I'm trying to figure out if there's a reliable way to apply Muggle film ratings to them so we can sell ones like this to the younger kids." "Film ratings?" Hermione explained the rating system to her. Ginny thought it was a great idea once she understood. They'd just come away from the daydream charm display when Harry and Ron grabbed her. "Hermione, there you are," Harry said softly. "We need to talk to you." Hermione quickly glanced around to make sure the shop was under control and led them back to the storage room. "What's going on, Harry?" she asked. "I think Malfoy's up to something," he said. She frowned. "What do you mean?" "We ran into him and Mrs. Malfoy in Madame Malkin's," Harry explained. "He was a real git there." "So was his mum," Ron added. "Yeah, but later we saw him walk by alone, and we didn't think Mrs. Malfoy would let him wander off without a good reason, so we gave Mr. and Mrs. Weasley the slip at the apothecary and followed him. He went to Borgin and Burke's. You know the seedy shop in Knockturn Alley?" "You didn't go in, did you?" Hermione said worriedly. "No, we used the extendable ears," Harry assured her. "He asked Borgin about fixing something and told him to hold the other one for him." "What was it?" "We don't know," Ginny said. "We couldn't see. He threatened to send someone named Greyback after him to keep him quiet, though, including keeping quiet to Malfoy's mum," Ron added. "Who's Greyback?" Hermione asked. "He's a werewolf," Harry said darkly. "The one who bit Remus. He told me about him. He's a really bad guy." He threatened a Borgin with a werewolf? Hermione whispered in horror. That's what it sounded like, Harry said. And that's not all. I think Malfoy's a Death Eater. A Death Eater? Why? He wouldn't let Madame Malkin see his left arm, and later he showed Borgin something we couldn't see, and it scared him just as bad as Greyback did. That's not much proof, she reasoned. Malfoy's only 16. Would Voldemort make him a Death Eater already? Hermione asked. No way, Ron said. Malfoy's too useless. If Voldemort thought he was useful, he probably would, Harry countered. It could happen. Hermione considered this. Harry seemed to have more insight into Voldemort's twisted mind than most people. She tried not to think that it might be the Horcrux's influence. And Draco Malfoy was the richest and most prominent child of a known Death Eater around, so if any student was going to become one, it would be him. But that didn't tell her anything about what he was doing. That's not much to go on, she told him. And you don't have any proof. I know, he said uncomfortably. I wish I knew what he was asking Borgin to hold for him. What he's planning would be more important, I think, she suggested. If he's planning anything at all. Revenge, I figure, Harry said. On whom? On us, you and me. His dad's in Azkaban because of us, right? I suppose so, she said. A slight tremor went through her. But with no proof, I don't see how there's anything we can do. Probably just tell your suspicions to Dumbledore. I will, but there's something bigger going on. I know it. All we can do is be careful, Harry, Hermione said. Come on, I need to get back out there. She didn't think the rest of the morning would cause any further trouble, but she received her biggest shock of the day an hour later when a wild-eyed man stumbled into the shop, and Fred took one look at him and said, I don't believe it. Hermione didn't recognize the man at first. He was dirty and disheveled, with a long mop of blonde hair and worn-out clothes that were a size too big for him. It wasn't until he spoke that it clicked for her. I'm looking for Hermione Granger, he said. I heard she might be here. It was Ludo Bagman. The former Quidditch star had been on the run for over a year, ever since he lost a lot of money to the Goblins and to Hermione, George, and Fred in the Quidditch World Cup and the Triwizard Tournament. He'd lost a lot of weight in that time, and he had dark circles around his eyes and a paranoid look on his face. But it was him. Yes, Mr. Bagman, I'm here, she said. Oh, thank Merlin, he gasped. Granger, please, you have to take it back. He rushed towards her, but George and Fred protectively closed ranks around her. What? She said nervously. What are you on about, Bagman? Fred demanded. You swindle us out of our savings, drop off the map for a year, and now you come crawling back to us? Hermione had to invent a whole new branch of magic just to fund the shop, George said. And George's got the marks from Umbridge because we didn't have the money to leave school, Fred added sternly. Bagman recoiled and bowed submissively. I'm sorry, he said. I was a fool. I just couldn't control myself and I lost everything. I just want you to take the book back, Granger. What book? George and Fred said in unison. Oh, Hermione said in surprise. He means the book I gave him, the one I told you about. Bagman nodded eagerly, and he pulled a thick dog-eared book from his robes and held it out towards her. I knew it had to be from you, he said. It's a Muggle book. Please, just take it back and lift the curse you've put on the thing. I can't sleep any more. Hermione obligingly stepped forward and took the book from him. She looked down at the cover, trying to hide a smirk. The book was a large tome titled The Complete Works of H.P. Lovecraft, but she'd printed in the fake subtitle beneath it. True Eyewitness Accounts of the Paranormal. Wow, I really didn't think this would work, she said. What? Bagman said. She smirked openly at him, then drew her wand, pointed at the book, and muttered, Tergio! Wiping away the subtitle. Bagman blinked in surprise. This book isn't cursed, Mr. Bagman, she informed him. It never was. All I did was write in a fake subtitle. Your own mind did the rest. Bagman continued to stare at her stupidly. It's fiction, 100% fabricated. There's no such thing as Cthulhu, or the Elder Things, or the Shoggoths, or the Necronomicon. It's not real, which you would have known if you'd done the least amount of research into what you knew was a Muggle book. In other words, George started. She pranked you! The twins shouted in unison, drawing laughs from those around them. Bagman kept staring, and finally collected himself. Oh, bloody hell! That was all a prank? Do you have any idea what grief you put me through, girl? Well, you gave me nightmares with that four-dimensional maze of yours in the tournament, Mr. Bagman, Hermione said. Not to mention all the grief that Harry went through in swindling a lot of people out of money. It's not my fault you ran away and didn't ask for help. So there you go. You're not cursed. You're welcome. The man looked like he would thoroughly like to berate her further, but looking around and seeing all the witnesses, he decided that discretion was the better part of valor. Right, he said. Thank you, Miss Granger. I suppose that's all I needed. He turned to leave. Hold up, Bagman. Fred stopped him. There's still the matter of the money you owe us, George said. Not to mention the goblins, Fred continued. Bagman paled. Look, I don't have anything anymore, he said quickly. And even if I did, I have to prioritize. You seem like you're doing pretty well for yourselves, and the goblins aren't exactly forgiving. Hermione had a brainwave. What if we could work out a deal, then? She said. A deal? What do you mean? Bill, could we talk to you? She called. Bill came over and stopped when he saw their guest, his eyes widening. Well, Ludovic Bagman, look what the Kneazle dragged in. You've been causing us a lot of trouble lately. Are the goblins still giving the Ministry a hard time? Hermione asked. Unfortunately, yes, Bill sighed. The goblins were neutral in the last war, but they've been more difficult about it this year because President Ragnarok has been pretty sore about him. He jerked a thorn at Bagman. It was his brother and two of the directors who he owes all that money to. Oh, so it's personal for them? Don't say that to their faces, but yes. Well, all the more reason to do something about it, Hermione said. I've got money now, so we have other options. Do you think we could go talk to them to try to work something out? At Gringotts, said Bill. Have you been there since the start of summer? Well, no. I've been doing everything through letters and bank drafts. Better keep it that way if you can, unless you want to stand in line 3 hours for the goblins' security, and risk getting a probity probe in unfortunate places. Well, that sounded unpleasant. But you work for them, Fred pointed out. You think that makes them feel any different? It sounds like Bagman's a high-profile case for them, though, George observed. Would that speed things along at all? Bill looked between his brothers, Hermione, and Bagman, and he groaned. Ah, hell, let's go ahead. This is a bad idea, Bill muttered to himself as they entered the building. Okay, basic rules of dealing with goblins. Don't lie, don't flatter them, don't make threats you can't follow through on, and don't waste their time. Odd choice of words, Hermione thought. He notably didn't mention politeness, which ought to have gone without saying, but the goblins tended to be pretty gruff themselves. It seemed like there was some kind of cultural gap that she didn't understand. Come to think of it, she really didn't know anything at all about goblins. We're here for a debtors' meeting, Bill told the goblins standing guard by the interior room in Gringotts. Names? One of the guards, the one carrying several different probes, asked. Ludovic Bagman, debtor. Frederick Weasley, George Weasley, and Hermione Granger, creditors. William Weasley, creditors' counsel, acting in my role as liaison between the goblins and wizards. One of the guards opened a locked bin, while the other began waving a probe over them. The guard at the outer door had merely waved a sketchy-looking gold probe over them and let them pass without comment. But this scan looked far deeper. Remove all wands and weapons, and place them in the bin. The goblin's probe made a whirring sound as it passed by Hermione's leg, and he added, And we do mean all. Hermione looked to Bill for confirmation. You have a right to request an alternate venue if you want to hold on to your wand, but I trust Gringotts' security, he said. She nodded her assent, and methodically, though not dragging it out, she removed her vinewood wand from her left sleeve, her red oak wand from her right sleeve, her homemade holdout wand from a makeshift leg holster, and her stiletto knife from a makeshift ankle holster. The guard actually raised an eyebrow at that last one, perhaps a tiny bit impressed. With that done, they were scanned with several probes, pronounced clean, and entered the room. An ornate conference table stood in the room, surrounded by ornate chairs, excepting the one in the end, which was plain wood, and, if Hermione wasn't mistaken, a couple inches lower than the others. That was Bagman's chair. The 5 of them took their seats, and a few minutes later 3 goblins entered, dressed in nicer clothes than usual for the goblin tellers, whom they recognized from Bagman's previous dealings with them as Nagnok, Gornok, and Bogrod. "Ludovic Bagman," Gornok growled as he took his seat. "It's about time you showed your sorry face again. You're an annoyingly difficult wizard to get a hold of." Bagman was, wisely, silent. "So, you are indebted to our booking agency in the amount of—" Gornok checked the ledger. 381 gallons, 11 sickles, and 11 nuts. And it looks like we're not the only ones." The goblins sent the Weasleys and Hermione a pointed look, which she quickly caught on to. "Yes, accounting for debts consolidated under Weasley's Wizarding Wheezes, we are Mr. Bagman's creditors in the amount of 460 gallons, 3 sickles, and 27 nuts. We have unconfirmed reports that he owes quite a few more people from his booking operation, but statistically, we're probably his largest creditors." "Fascinating," Gornok said, with obvious contempt. "So, what do you have to say for yourself, Mr. Bagman?" Bagman gave them a very nervous grin. "Look," he said, "you already took everything I have. I went out and tried to get some work in the Muggle world because I wouldn't have any baggage out there, but, well, it's harder than I thought." Hermione cocked an eyebrow at him. "What were you expecting, Mr. Bagman?" she asked. "With you being on the run, you had no references, no experience, and no permanent address. I can't imagine that it's that different in the magical world when it comes to getting work." "You're not the first to claim such, Mr. Bagman," Bogrod said, ignoring her conversation. "It's clear enough from your present state that you were doing nothing but trying to evade your reckoning." But what can I do? I still don't have any money." "Actually, I thought we might be able to reach an agreement on that, Mr. Bagman," Hermione suggested. The goblins narrowed their eyes suspiciously at her, while Bagman looked up at her hopefully. "What are you suggesting, Miss Granger?" Gornok demanded. "Our financial situation has recently changed," she said. "We have more flexibility now, and I thought it would be good if we could resolve this problem amicably in the interest of goblin-wizard relations. Now, Mr. Bagman, we could do this by the book and hire a solicitor to file an involuntary bankruptcy petition against you, or I could buy out your debt to the goblins, and you can work off the full amount in the shop." Fred and George glanced at each other in understanding and grinned, but to her surprise, the goblins hissed. "Typical wizards," Gornok said, "bailing out their own and wanting to keep all the money lending in the family so we can't do anything to you." Hermione frowned, surprised that they took her suggestion that way. She wasn't sure how to respond, and Fred and George weren't either, but fortunately Bill stepped in. "It's self-interested, yes, but more insofar as it's to our advantage to resolve this matter to improve relations during the war. Either way, you're still getting what you want, your money, and quicker than you would have otherwise. However it is that Hermione got it." He shot her a worried glance. "And it's not like we'll let him off the hook, either," Fred said, catching on. "He conned us out of more money than he did you. It so happens that we lost a good friend a couple months ago. It was really awful, and it means we could use an extra pair of hands at the shop while he works it off." "I see," Bogrod said thoughtfully. "And you actually have the money to do this, Miss Granger?" "I can make it a loan from one of my other businesses, Director Bogrod," Hermione said. She reached into her handbag for her Gringotts checkbook. It wasn't really a checkbook, but a book of forms for bank drafts, which wizards used for large transactions. Since there was only one bank in the country, and it dealt mostly in physical gold, it didn't make sense to use checks, credit cards, or any of the myriad other financial instruments the Muggle world had developed. "I can authorize a draft right now for 381 gallons, 11 sickles, and 11 nuts from Vault 1337 into Mr. Bagman's vault, which you can then take to settle his debt to you. Thank you, Prince Alwaleed," she thought, and that recent letter from New York looked interesting too. "What about interest?" Nagnok asked greedily. Did you set up a payment plan with Mr. Bagman? Bill asked. If not, then you can't assess interest in a formal debt arbitration since it's assumed to have been a gentleman's agreement. Nagnock scowled. Well played, Cursebreaker Weasley. Do we have a deal, then? Asked Fred. The goblins conversed with each other for a minute in their rapid, vaguely Norse-sounding language, and came to a consensus. Very well, Weasley, Gornak said. If Granger will give us the draft, we will have a deal. Hermione quickly filled out the form, being careful to make sure all the I's were dotted and all the T's were crossed before handing it over. The three goblins examined it and rose to leave without comment. Thank you for your time, Hermione said, and she rose as well. Now, Mr. Bagman, that leaves you owing us a combined 841 gallons, 15 sickles, and 9 nuts. I'll leave it to George and Fred to arrange how you can pay that off. Just don't run off again. She leaned close to him and whispered in his ear as she passed. Tekeli-lee. Bagman let out an unmanly yelp and flinched away, ready to agree profusely to whatever deal her boyfriend and his twin had to offer. What are the goblins like, Bill? Hermione asked. Excuse me? It was one of the few times that summer that Hermione was able to get away from home after the store opening, Harry's birthday. It was almost certainly the only time Hermione and Bill would meet before she started her new ancient runes lessons in September. During a lull in the party, she broke away to ask Bill a few questions she'd been wondering about. The goblins, she repeated. I wanted to ask you the day we went to Gringotts, but there wasn't time. What about them? What are they like, their society, their culture, their magic? It's clearly pretty different from wizards, but even though we learnt about the Goblin Rebellions ad nauseum in history class, we learnt next to nothing about them as a people. Bill stared at her as if he was seeing her for the first time. Wow, he said. Not many witches or wizards ever think to ask that question. Most don't care. You'd think they would, though. They handle the money, and it seems like relations with them are shaky. Plus, for other Muggleborns like me, you'd think we'd want to learn all we could about the magical world. Until Binns kills your interest in magical history, Bill pointed out. Well, true, she admitted. Even her fellow Muggleborns couldn't stay awake in that class. Sit down, then. Bill grabbed a bottle of butterbeer for each of them and took a seat. So there are a lot of misconceptions about goblins out there. A lot of wizards think of them as a dangerous warrior race, mainly because of all the goblin rebellions and battle axes and such, but they're really not when you get to know them. And if wizards don't think that, they usually think of goblins as a race of greedy money-grubbing bankers, but that's not right either. That's not to say they aren't dangerous, both physically and in their guile, and quick to offense too. But if you asked them, what they really identify as is craftsmen. Really? She'd never heard that before. Even though goblin craftsmanship was highly prized, it certainly wasn't emphasized in history class. So, more like the dwarves of Norse mythology? Yes, the Norse term is svaltafar. The gobbledygook term is similar. It's svartaf. Goblin is just the label they take in English, and a fairly recent one at that. It was an act of reappropriating a derogatory name wizards gave them in the 17th century. But as I said, in goblin culture, they value fine craftsmanship above all else. Even the Goblin King isn't the strongest warrior or the cleverest politician. He's the most skilled craftsman. Hermione frowned. She'd definitely never heard that before, and it didn't really make sense. What kind of craft? She asked. Swordsmithing? No. That's one of those misconceptions everyone believes. First of all, it can be any craft. The king is most commonly a metal worker, or failing that a stonemason or a gem cutter, but any master craftsman can challenge the king if he or she feels their work is superior. Queen Harriet was a weaver of fine tapestries. 1 or 2 were painters. Nidhavel the Soft-Spoken was actually a composer, although he was controversial because he didn't create a physical craft. And they think this is the best way to find someone who can lead a country? She asked. There's a goblin proverb that says, "One who can shape fine gold can also shape nations," he explained. Roughly. It loses something in translation, but it's sort of like the old line that he can be trusted with a little can be trusted with much. And besides, Can you really say our form of government is any better?" She had to admit he had a point. "But here's the thing, Hermione," Bill said. "Even though their swords and armor are beyond compare, the goblins' craftsmanship doesn't revolve around weapons. Or if it does, it's because they feel they've been driven to it. At their core, they create for the beauty of it. Their finest works are jewelry and decoration, not swords." That, Hermione thought, she understood. "On silvern necklaces they strung the flowering stars," she quoted. "On crowns they hung the dragonfire. In a twisted wire they meshed the light of sun and moon." Bill stared at her with wide eyes. "Did you become a poet all of a sudden?" She shook her head. "That was Tolkien, a Muggle writer, describing the craft of the dwarves in his fantasy." Ironically, she actually remembered the poem from the animated film more so than the book. "Well, he came nearer to it than I ever would have expected a Muggle to. The goblin culture really revolves around that ideal, like how they view the work of your hands as sacred, as something that can't lawfully be taken away from you. That's another major issue. They do sell their wares, and at exorbitant prices, but only to the buyer themselves, not to their descendants. A lot of wizards, if they even know that, like to say they're greedy and only rent out what they make, but they don't see it that way. Because they consider the work of their hands sacred, they say that when the buyer dies, the maker has the highest priority of inheritance." That's interesting. I can see how that would work self-consistently, but I imagine it causes friction with wizards, though." "That's an understatement. They still complain about Hogwarts holding on to the sword of Gryffindor, and that was 1,000 years ago. But of course the biggest conflict between goblins and wizards is about wand use. Goblins are capable of using wands, but the Ministry only allows humans and part-humans to carry them." "Typical pure-blooded prejudice," Hermione grumbled. Personally, I'm not convinced wands would do them much good, but fair enough. Anyway, there's a lot more to learn. If you want, I can give you a little more overview during our lessons this autumn." "That would be good if we have time, thanks," she said. She rejoined the party, but not before an odd thought struck her. I could use a sword." "Septima, you have to see this!" That was what Hermione's letter to Septima had said when she invited her to her house for dinner and a show. Yes, that was exactly what she had written. For all her closeness with Hermione and her family, Septima Vector had only been to her favorite student's house once. The very first time they met, when Hermione had tested into arithmancy. Since then, the Grangers had mostly kept home and school life separate, and while they had met for dinner a few times, it had always been at the Leaky Cauldron. But in this case, Hermione wanted to show her one of her Muggle television shows, so it had to be at her home. It was certainly good to see Hermione and her family again, and under favorable circumstances for once. Most of her interactions with the Grangers over the years had involved explaining to them why their daughter had almost died this time. She couldn't say that she wasn't glad to see Hermione take that job over for herself. And from the look of things, she was doing well for herself. She hadn't been involuntarily shipped back to France, anyway. Septima did notice that the Granger household looked more magical than the last time she was there, and not just because a house elf was cooking supper. Hermione's workspace was filled with an honestly worrying amount of spellbooks, runes, things that looked like alchemical diagrams, and half-finished artifacts, along with copious arithmancy material. She reached out and touched several scraps of jet-black cloth that wasn't made from any material she recognized, and felt like it must have some kind of magical properties. "What is this, Hermione?" she asked. "Bulletproof nanofiber cloth. I decided to try to make a whole outfit out of it. It'll stand up to most physical attacks, and I'm going to have George and Fred enchant them with extra protections." Of course, that was trickier than the cloak. Clothing was hard to enchant, both because of Gamp's law, and because of the amount of time it spent in contact with the human body, which, for witches and wizards, could interfere with it, depending on the charms. "Wow, you're really going all out, aren't you?" "After what happened at the Ministry, I have to," she said simply. Septima wasn't surprised. The dinner was very good, and it was nice to be able to catch up, but Septima was much more interested in the show Hermione wanted to show her. As for Hermione, there was no doubt about how amazing this was to her. She'd finally had a chance to see, and tape, the documentary about fractals that she'd heard so much about. It wasn't even a new documentary. It had run last year, but Hermione wasn't at home enough to have seen it until now. It was called Fractals, The Colors of Infinity, and as a bonus, it was narrated by her favorite Muggle author, Arthur C. Clarke, and it absolutely dazzled her. She'd seen a few colored pictures of fractals like the Mandelbrot set before in books, but the kaleidoscope of shifting colors and continuous zooms over an astonishing range of scales played again and again in the course of an hour was 100 times as vivid as anything she had ever seen before. The amount of computing power it must have taken to generate those images must have been staggering. She wondered if she could program a parchment to draw fractals like the mathematician's map drew the castle, and what its capabilities would be. The runes would certainly be simple enough, simpler than the map itself, but what was the fundamental speed of rune calculations? It might take her entire mastery to pull it off. Wouldn't that be ironic, receiving her mastery for a purely aesthetic project after everything else she'd done? Hermione put in the tape and started the program. Septima was interested at once from the title screen, and by 5 minutes in, when they started showing the deep zooms, she was as dazzled as Hermione was.
"This is amazing," she said. "That's all mathematically calculated? How can they do that?"
Hermione paused the tape.
"Well, first, television isn't exactly a moving picture like magical photos. They show still pictures one after another very fast, so it looks like it's moving. 25 pictures per second normally. And each picture is drawn by a computer, or probably several computers, that can do the arithmetic operations millions of times per second. And even then, it can take more than an hour to draw each one because it's so complicated." "Merlin! Millions of operations per second?" "Billions for the most advanced ones. It's thousands of times the level of that light code you made to protect the Philosopher's Stone in my first year. I don't know if it's even possible in principle with magic." "Phew, I don't know either. And at those scales, I doubt even Professor Babbling does."
Septima already knew most of the explanation of what the Mandelbrot set was, and how it was computed, from what Hermione had told her, but she wasn't prepared for how Muggles had raised the maths to an art form. How they could make graphs that looked eerily like acacia trees. How they could paint realistic pictures of mountains, purely from fractal geometry. She didn't know that it could be used to analyze the structures of plants, clouds, the rings of Saturn, and even galaxies. The other surprise for her, however, which Hermione had not expected, was Stephen Hawking. Hawking appeared to be a gaunt man sitting motionless in a chair, who spoke with a strange voice despite the frozen rictus on his face.
"What's wrong with him?" she asked. "Him? Oh, I suppose you wouldn't recognize it. He has a nerve disease that leaves him almost completely paralyzed," Hermione explained. "Goodness! But how can he speak, then?" "He writes words by clicking that switch in his hand in a special code, and a computer speaks the words." "Really? And he's a mathematician?" "A cosmologist. Like an unspeakable, but less secretive. He's one of the most brilliant scientists in the world. He can do functional integrals in his head, and even I can't do that."
There were Muggles who were even smarter than Hermione? Intellectually, she knew there must be, but the thought was intimidating, especially seeing one who must have overcome so many other difficulties.
"I've never heard of anything like that," she said. "There are patients in St. Mungo's who look like him, whom everyone's written off, and he's a top researcher." "Like Neville's parents?" Hermione thought briefly. "But no, Neville's mother can move under her own power. She'd find a way to send a message if she could, and even if most wizards were oblivious enough to miss it, Neville wouldn't." "Well, it depends on the condition of the brain," she said. "Motor neuron disease is distinctive in how it only paralyzes the body without hurting the mind. Anyway—"
She started the tape again, and, lest Septima think this was a purely mathematical and scientific endeavor, the Muggles described commercial, military, and even medical applications like fractal image compression and spy satellites that mostly went over her head, but clearly were very important. However, she really got lost near the end with the talk of the appearance of fractals in the brain and in art and in the notion of free will.
"What?" she said in confusion. "Collective unconscious? What is he talking about, Hermione?" This is kind of a bit off the deep end, Septima," she admitted. He's talking about fractals being some fundamental way to understand the universe and ourselves, but I think he's overplaying it. Obviously, it's not even all true, Mrs. Granger cut in. It's not? No, it's like the eye thing. They're called phosphenes. The images you see if you press on your eyeballs. They're caused by pressure stimulating the light-sensitive cells in the eyes. There's nothing mystically mathematical about them. Yes, well, he does tend to get mystical, Hermione said. Arthur Clarke has a saying, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Septima raised an eyebrow. Taken one way, it means that magic, real magic, is fundamentally explainable by Muggle science. We just don't know how yet. He doesn't know about magic, of course, but I believe it. The thing is, in his books, he usually goes the other direction. The beings with supreme technology are like gods or angels, and they're completely inscrutable. Well, I suppose anyone can get strange ideas, Septima offered. But I can see why you were so excited about fractal geometry now. This is a whole world that we Arithmancers never even imagined. I'll have to see if I can do anything more with it. I had some ideas of my own for my mastery, Hermione agreed, but we can discuss them at school. Of course, I'll probably see you next in September, but you can call on me any time. Thank you for dinner, Mr. and Mrs. Granger.
It was no problem, Professor, Mr. Granger said.
Stay safe, Septima, Hermione told her. You too, Hermione. Dear Mr. Trump, both of the requested pieces will be delivered upon payment of 55,000 United States dollars, by check or wire transfer to Archimedes Jewelers at Barclays, Lombard Street in London. I'm sure you will find them suitably huge. Archimedes.